Hello everyone, welcome back to the Hunting Hour. You enjoy our stories. First story, The Lost House on Black Hollow Road. It stood at the very edge of Black Hollow Road, a forgotten path most wouldn't dare drive down after dark. Locals whispered about the house that loomed there, a sagging skeleton of wood and stone, its windows like hollow eye sockets, staring out over the overgrown fields. They called it the Lost House on Black Hollow Road, not because it was the final home at the dead end, but because everyone who went inside was never quite the same, if they came back at all. It was October when Clara and her friends decided to prove the stories wrong. The air was cold enough to bite, and the trees along the road were skeletal things, their branches scratching at the sky. There were 4 of them, Clara, Tom, Jess, and Mike, armed with flashlights and phones, eager to document their bravery. They laughed as they passed the faded road sign, its paint peeling, Black Hollow Road barely legible. But their laughter died when the house came into view. Even from a distance, the house was wrong. The angles were too sharp, the shadows too deep. Windows hung open like broken mouths, and the door, slightly ajar, seemed to be waiting for them. As they approached, Jess hesitated. "Guys, do you hear that?" They stopped. At first, it was nothing but the wind. Then, beneath it, the faintest sound of whispering, soft, urgent, impossible to tell where it came from. "Probably the wind," Tom said, but his voice shook. They stepped inside. The air was colder in the house, heavy, as if thick with dust and something older. Their footsteps echoed on warped floorboards. Walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, revealing claw marks beneath. They found strange symbols scratched into the wood, circles crossed with lines, spirals that seemed to move if you looked too long. "Is that blood?" Mike asked, pointing to a dark stain by the staircase. Clara knelt. It was brown and crusted, long dried. "It's old, maybe paint," but they all knew it wasn't. The whispering grew louder as they moved deeper into the house. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath their feet. They climbed the stairs, each step creaking like a scream. On the second floor, the temperature dropped again. Their breath fogged the air. One door stood closed at the end of the hall, unlike the others swinging loosely on their hinges. "I don't like this," Jess whispered, clutching Clara's arm. "Let's check it out, and then we'll leave," Clara said. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob. It turned too easily. Inside was a child's room, untouched by time. A wooden rocking horse sat in the corner, its paint flaking away. Dolls lined a shelf, the glass eyes cracked and cloudy. But it was the crib in the middle of the room that drew their attention. Empty, save for a single tattered blanket that shifted slightly, as if something had just been there. Mike cursed under his breath and backed away. "We need to go." But then the door slammed shut behind them. The whispering swelled into a chorus of voices, frantic and angry. The dolls' heads turned in unison toward them, mouths parting in silent screams. The rocking horse began to move, slowly at first, then faster, banging against the wall. Jess screamed as something invisible grabbed her wrist and pulled. Clara lunged, catching her other hand, but the force was too strong. Jess was dragged toward the crib, her fingers slipping from Clara's grasp. Then everything went silent. Jess stood perfectly still. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. Slowly, she turned to Clara, but it wasn't Jess anymore. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, and when she spoke, it wasn't her voice. "You shouldn't be here." Tom and Mike yanked open the door and bolted, dragging Clara with them. They didn't stop as Jess, or whatever she had become, laughed behind them, the sound unnatural, scraping against their minds. They ran down the stairs, but the house was changing. The hallway stretched, doors multiplying along the walls. Each door they opened revealed only darkness. "Where's the exit?" Tom gasped. Clara pointed. "There." But the front door was now at the end of an impossibly long corridor. As they ran, shadows peeled off the walls and reached for them. Mike cried out as one wrapped around his ankle, pulling him into an open doorway. Tom grabbed him, but it was too late. The door slammed shut, and his scream was cut off. Clara and Tom reached the front door, throwing themselves against it. It wouldn't budge. The whispers returned, closer this time. Tom's flashlight flickered and died. In the dark, Clara could feel cold fingers brushing her neck. "Please," she whispered, but the house didn't care. Then the door burst open, and they fell out into the yard. The house groaned behind them, as if displeased. Tom didn't stop to look back. He dragged Clara down the road, their lungs burning. Second story. No one slept in Blackwood Forest. No one slept in Blackwood Forest. That was the rule. The old folks in the village warned anyone who passed through. If you camped there, if you stayed too long, the forest noticed. And once it noticed you, it didn't forget. But rules were meant to be broken, or so thought Daniel and his friends. They were students, hunters of the supernatural, and eager for a thrill. Blackwood was famous in certain circles, mentioned on obscure forums with posts that always ended suddenly. Daniel told himself it was all stories, urban legends twisted by time. They arrived on a gray afternoon, the forest dense and quiet. No birds sang, no wind rustled the leaves. Even their footsteps on the pine needle-covered floor seemed swallowed by the thick silence. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air became, like breathing through cloth. Still, they pressed on, setting up camp in a clearing marked by a strange ring of black stones. Daniel ignored the pit in his stomach. They lit a fire as dusk crept in, and laughter slowly died into wary glances. "We stay up all night," Daniel said. Simple, but the forest had its own plans. By midnight, Tom had dozed off in his chair. Daniel shook him hard. "Stay awake, man." Tom's eyes opened, but they were wrong, glassy and unfocused. His mouth moved slowly, as if he were trying to speak underwater. Then he stood, stiff as a corpse, and began walking into the trees. "Tom!" shouted Marissa, running after him. The others followed, but the forest swallowed them quickly. Daniel's flashlight cut thin slices of light through the darkness. The beams bent strangely, as if the shadows had weight. They found Tom standing motionless in a shallow pool of water. Marissa screamed when she saw his reflection. It was smiling, though his real face was blank. He turned slowly to them. His reflection did not. It stayed, smiling wider as cracks appeared across its face, like breaking glass. A hand, thin and bone-pale, rose from beneath the black water and seized Tom by the ankle. He didn't resist. He let himself be dragged under with barely a ripple. Marissa leapt in after him, but there was no bottom. She sank out of sight, her scream muffled by the still surface. Daniel froze. His breath came sharp and fast. Only he and Aaron remained. Aaron backed away slowly. "We need to go. Now." They ran, the dark pressing in tighter with every step. The clearing was gone. The trees seemed to move, closing off paths that were there seconds before. Aaron's flashlight flickered and died. Daniel grabbed his wrist. "Stay with me." Then the whispering began. faint at first, like wind through dry grass. It grew louder, words Daniel couldn't understand, filling his skull with ice. Aaron stopped, his head tilted as if listening. "No," Daniel hissed. "Don't listen." But Aaron was smiling now, his teeth too many, too sharp. His mouth split farther than it should have, ear to ear. "It's beautiful," Aaron whispered. He lunged. Daniel ducked, stumbling backward as Aaron snapped his jaws at empty air. Then Aaron screamed as something yanked him upward by the neck into the branches. His legs kicked, his hands clawed, but he vanished into the black canopy. A rain of red followed. Daniel ran until his lungs burned. The whispers followed. The trees leaned in close. Faces appeared in the bark, staring, watching, mouths moving in silent warnings. He tripped over a root and landed hard. When he looked up, there was a house in front of him, old and rotting, its windows black holes. Smoke drifted from the chimney, though no fire burned. He had two choices: stay outside with the voices, or go in. Inside was worse. The walls wept dark liquid. Footprints marked the floor, appearing fresh, though no one walked there. A staircase wound upward into darkness. He climbed, because something worse was crawling behind him in the hall. At the top was a room with a single window. Beyond it, blackwood stretched in every direction. In the corner sat a child, pale, thin, its eyes black voids. It smiled when it saw him. "You shouldn't be here," it said in a voice far too deep. Daniel backed away, but the window was already open. Cold fingers wrapped around his neck, dragging him back. As his vision dimmed, he saw shapes emerging from the forest, hundreds of them, pale and hollow-eyed. No one sleeps in Blackwood, and no one ever leaves. They found Daniel months later, sitting at the edge of the forest, staring with glassy eyes. His lips moved, repeating something over and over, though no sound came out. They took him to the hospital. He never spoke again, but at night, nurses swore they heard him whisper, and sometimes he smiled, too wide, with too many teeth. No one sleeps in Blackwood Forest, because when you do, it wakes up. Third story, Eyes in the Static. The old television in Darren's apartment shouldn't have worked. He'd found it on the curb, left out for trash. Dusty, screen cracked at one corner, dials missing, but he took it anyway. Something about it intrigued him. It felt heavy with history, the kind of object that still carried the residue of its past owners. He wiped it down, plugged it in, and the screen flickered to life. At first, it was just static. A dull gray snowstorm, the soft hiss filling the empty space of his living room. He left it on while he worked, background noise against the silence. The static seemed different, almost soothing, like whispers buried beneath the white noise. Then the eyes appeared. The first time, it was a fleeting glimpse. Darren glanced up from his notebook and saw them, two pale circles deep within the static. They blinked. Then they were gone. He convinced himself it was a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games. But the next night, they were there again, watching, patient. He found himself staring back. Hours slipped by as he watched those faint shapes shift in the screen. They moved closer each night, clearer, more human. But the faces were wrong, too smooth, their features melting into the static, like wax figures set to boil. He should have unplugged the television, thrown it out the window, but he didn't. Something about it felt impossible to leave. One night, while the rain tapped against the windows, he heard it, not from the speakers, but inside the apartment. A voice, software, crooked. Darren. He froze. His name, spoken in a voice like broken glass. He turned toward the television. The static had cleared in one spot, forming a dark tunnel. Deep inside, eyes gleamed, and then a hand pressed against the glass from the inside. The fingers were too long, the nails sharp and black. It pushed. The glass bulged outward like thin plastic. Darren stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The bulge shrank, the hand disappearing. The static returned, but now it churned, angry and alive. The whispering grew louder, filling every corner of the room. He pulled the plug from the wall, heart pounding. The static didn't stop. The screen still glowed, dim and pulsing like a heartbeat. The eyes stared through it. He backed out of the room, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The next morning, he found claw marks on the inside of his windows, deep gouges in the wood of his floor. He threw a sheet over the TV, wrapped it in duct tape, shoved it in the closet. But the sound of static still seeped out at night, soft at first, then louder. Sometimes he'd wake up and find the door open, the television sitting in the middle of the room. The screen cracked wider, something wet glistening along the edges. He stopped inviting people over. He stopped answering calls. His friends came by once or twice, but left after a few minutes, pale and shaken. None came back. He was alone. And then the eyes started appearing elsewhere, in mirrors, in the reflection of the toaster, in the glass of his phone's screen when it went dark, always watching, sometimes blinking slowly, sometimes smiling. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer and smashed the television. Glass shattered, sparks flew. Black liquid oozed out, thick and cold. It hissed as it touched the air. He kept hitting it until the metal warped and the screen was unrecognizable. The apartment went quiet. For the first time in weeks, Darren slept. But the next morning, his reflection didn't move with him. He noticed it while brushing his teeth. He spit into the sink, and when he looked up, his reflection was still staring, mouth closed. Then it smiled. Not his smile. It raised its hand, even though his hand stayed at his sides, and in its palm was an eye, blinking, watching. The mirror cracked. A thin, jagged line ran through his reflection's face. Black static bled through the crack. It spread across the glass, turning the entire surface into a swirl of snow and noise. Hands pressed from the other side. Faces, hundreds of them, stared back. "Darren," they whispered. "Let us in." He stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. Every reflective surface in the apartment turned black and white, swirling with static and eyes. The screen of his phone vibrated, the same hiss pouring out of it. The toaster rattled on the counter. The windows darkened. He dropped to his knees. Hands grabbed him from the floor, pale and wet, pulling him down. His reflection watched as he disappeared, his own face staring back at him, expressionless. They found the apartment days later, empty. No sign of Darren. Only a broken television in the middle of the room, screen glowing faintly. Sometimes, if you walk by that building at night, you'll hear the static. You might see a faint glow in one of the windows. And if you're unlucky enough to get too close, you might catch a glimpse of eyes in the glass, waiting. Fourth story. She waits by the window. They say she waits by the window every night, long after the house has gone quiet. People walking past on their way home from the village claim they see her silhouette, pale and still, framed by the dusty glass. Some swear they catch a glimmer of her eyes reflecting the moonlight, watching, unblinking. No one knows who she is or why she waits. They just know not to look up. But curiosity has its price. It was Tom who first spoke of her, laughing at the old stories like they were nothing but a joke. "It's a scare tactic," he said. "Parents trying to keep kids from wandering off." He and his friends, Mia, Jordan, and Ellie, were the type who chased thrills. So, one night, they found themselves standing in front of the house where the window waited. Old Langdon Place, it was called, abandoned since before anyone could remember. The house stood crooked at the edge of town, its roof sagging under the weight of time, shutters hanging loose. But the window was clean, the glass somehow unbroken. In the faint glow of the streetlight, they could see it clearly on the second floor, waiting. They went in through the front door. It swung open without a sound. Inside, the air was heavy and still, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Their flashlights flickered as they stepped through the empty hall, boards groaning under their feet. "She's supposed to be up there," Tom whispered, pointing to the staircase. His voice sounded hollow in the gloom. They climbed. Each step seemed softer than the last, like sinking into something rotten. At the top, the hallway stretched out, lined with rooms whose doors stood open like dark mouths. But it was the last room at the end where the window waited. The door was shut. Ellie was the first to hesitate. "Maybe this was a bad idea," she said. But Tom was already walking. He turned the knob. The door swung inward with a faint hiss. The room was empty, or so it seemed at first. The window stood open, moonlight pooling across the wooden floor. In front of it was a chair, facing out, and in the chair was her. They froze. She was thin, skin pale as bone, her black hair falling straight down her back like curtains of shadow. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Her head was tilted just slightly, as if listening. "Hello?" Tom said. Her head turned, slow and unnatural. A cracking sound echoed, as if her neck hadn't moved in years. When she faced them, they saw her eyes, white, milky, wide. Her lips peeled back in a slow, jagged smile. Mia screamed. Tom grabbed her hand and yanked her back toward the hall. Jordan and Ellie ran too, pounding down the stairs. But the house had changed. The staircase twisted, folding into itself like a spiral. The walls pulsed, wet and breathing. "She's behind us," Ellie gasped, tears streaking her cheeks. "She's coming." They didn't look back. They kept running, deeper into the house, where they couldn't tell if they were going up or down. Doors slammed shut behind them. Windows disappeared. The only light came from above, moonlight from that single window, no matter how far they ran. Eventually, they found themselves back in the room again. She was still there, waiting by the window. Tom stepped forward. He didn't want to. His feet moved without him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice thin and shaking. She stood, slowly. Her bones cracked as she moved, every joint stiff with age. She raised one hand and pointed to the chair. "Sit," she whispered. Tom struggled, but his legs carried him forward. He sat. The chair groaned under his weight. She smiled wider, her teeth yellowed and sharp. She placed her hands on his shoulders, gentle at first. "Now you wait," she whispered. Tom screamed as something rooted him in place. His skin hardened, cracking like old paint. His eyes clouded over. His mouth froze mid-plea. He became still. Jordan and Ellie dragged Mia away, back down the twisting hall, but the house was folding around them. Walls squeezed closer. Floors shifted. Soon they were separated, screaming for each other, their voices muffled by the dark. Ellie found herself in a narrow corridor that ended in the window. She could see out over the town, lights flickering in the distance. She placed her hands on the glass. Behind her, the sound of footsteps. "She waits," a voice whispered. "So should you." Ellie turned in time to see the woman, no, the thing, emerge from the shadows. Pale hands reached out, fingers impossibly long. Ellie backed against the window, but it was too late. The hands found her throat and pulled her down. Jordan's screams didn't last much longer. By morning, the house was still, empty, quiet. But if you walked past Old Langdon Place that night, you'd see her. She waits by the window. Only now there are others. Tom's blank eyes stare beside her. Ellie stands behind the chair, hands on its back. Jordan watches from the far side, his face split by an empty grin. And fifth story, the harvest of Bonn. Every autumn, when the leaves turned brittle and the wind grew sharp, the villagers of Grey Hollow whispered about the harvest of bones. They said it began long ago, when the land was rich and the fields yielded more than anyone could need. But prosperity always comes with a price. The legend spoke of a deal made in desperation. One harsh winter, when famine crept into the village and children wasted away by the hearth, the elders had gathered in secret. They prayed, they begged, and finally, they offered. What they promised, no one knows. But the fields turned fertile again, and no one starved. Years passed, crops flourished, livestock multiplied. But then came the first harvest, when the wheat bled red. That was when the bone collector arrived. Tall as a tree, and thin as famine itself, it walked from the edge of the forest when the fields were ripe. Its skull gleamed white beneath a hood of stitched flesh. Long fingers like branches scraped across the earth as it moved. And where it walked, bones sprouted from the soil, femurs like fence posts, ribs tangled like brambles. No one dared to challenge it. They left their doors open and their sick outside, hoping it would be satisfied. It never was. Now, each autumn, the village prepared. Houses were boarded tight, windows shuttered. Families whispered final prayers and kissed their children's foreheads one last time. No one worked the fields during the harvest of bones. No one ventured beyond their doors, except for Thomas. He was young, angry at the fear that ruled the village. His brother had vanished the year before, bones found gnawed clean in the fields. Thomas swore he would stop the thing that haunted them. So on the first night of the harvest, he armed himself with his father's rusted scythe and set out. The fields glowed silver in the moonlight. Stalks of corn taller than men swayed in a wind that didn't touch anything else. Thomas moved slowly, his boots crunching over old bones half buried in the dirt. It wasn't long before he heard it, the scrape of bone against bone, the brittle clatter of something moving where nothing should. He pressed on, breath tight in his chest. Then he saw it. The bone collector stood at the heart of the fields. It was hunched, digging through the soil with long skeletal hands, pulling things up. Bones, skulls, spines, ribs, all polished clean, all placed in careful patterns on the ground. It turned toward him. Empty sockets burned with a pale light. It tilted its head, as if listening, then began to move. Its joints cracked with every step. It carried no weapon. It didn't need one. Thomas raised the scythe and swung. The blade passed through air. The collector wasn't there anymore. He spun around. Too late. Cold fingers wrapped around his wrist and squeezed. Bones cracked in his arm. He screamed. The thing leaned close, breath like dust in his face. "You are late," it whispered. The world spun. He was falling, dragged into the soil itself. The earth opened under him, swallowing him whole. He fought, clawed at the dirt, but roots wrapped around his legs and pulled him deeper. He saw them then, faces in the soil, empty eye sockets, jaws frozen open in silent screams, bones tangled in roots, some still fresh, flesh clinging to them like old bark. He tried to scream, but the dirt filled his mouth. And then, silence. When the sun rose, the villagers found the scythe standing upright in the middle of the field. Its blade gleamed, red with blood that wouldn't wash off. Beneath it, the earth was freshly turned, soft like a grave. No one spoke of Thomas again. The harvest came and went. The bone collector returned to the forest when its work was done, but the village was different now. The crops grew taller, faster. The pumpkins swelled like bloated corpses. The wheat turned pale as bone. Some said the fields whispered at night, voices rising with the wind. And in the autumns that followed, the harvest of bones grew longer. The collector came sooner. It no longer waited for offerings. It took what it wanted. One year, the villagers found bones sprouting from their own fields, thin white fingers breaking through the soil, clutching at the sky. A ribcage grew from the garden behind the baker's house, curving up like a twisted gate. Skulls bloomed in the orchards, teeth glinting where apples once hung. And then, one by one, people vanished from their homes. Doors were left open, hearths still warm, food uneaten. There were no screams, just emptiness. No one tended the fields after that. The village fell silent, houses left to rot, but the fields kept growing, fed by something deeper than rain and sun. They say that if you walk near Grey Hollow now, you can hear the wind moving through those fields. But it doesn't sound like rustling leaves. And if you stand too long, you'll feel the ground shift beneath you. Because something is always hungry. And the harvest of bones never ends. Sixth story, the Forgotten Room. It was a room that shouldn't have existed. At least that's what Nora told herself when she found the door. She and her husband had just bought the old Ashcroft house. It was cheap, too cheap, but they told themselves it was a lucky break, a fixer-upper, something they could turn into a home. The place was huge, with long halls and creaking floors, high ceilings with plaster molding that had cracked and flaked over the years. The previous owner had passed away, and most of the house sat untouched, covered in sheets and dust. Nora loved exploring it. Every room had a story. But then, on a rainy afternoon, she found the door at the end of the hall on the second floor. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. The paint was fresh, the doorknob a dull, polished brass. No dust on it like the rest of the house. It wasn't on the floor plans either. Her fingers hovered over the knob. She hesitated. Then, curiosity won. The door creaked open into darkness. Nora stepped inside, the air heavy and cold, the kind that made your breath hang in front of you. She found a light switch, flicked it. The room lit up with a dim, amber glow. It was small. 4 walls, no windows. A rocking chair sat in the center, swaying gently, though there was no breeze. The wallpaper was old, peeling in places, covered in faded patterns of twisting vines. There was something wrong with it. The vines looked almost like veins. As she stepped closer, she noticed the floor was uneven, a bump beneath the faded rug. Nora knelt down and peeled the rug back. There was a trapdoor. Her heart thudded in her chest. She shouldn't open it. Every part of her screamed not to, but her hand moved anyway, lifting the wooden door by its rusted iron ring. Below was only darkness. A breath of cold air rushed up, smelling of damp earth and something else. Something coppery. She should have closed it. She should have walked away. Instead, she fetched a flashlight and pointed it down. The beam caught stairs leading deep underground. She called for her husband, but he wasn't home yet. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic creak of the rocking chair behind her, still moving. She descended. The stairs went down farther than they should have. The basement of the house wasn't this deep. She counted the steps. 20, 40, 60. She stopped counting. The air grew colder with each step. The walls were rough stone, damp and weeping. At the bottom was another door, smaller, made of old, rotting wood. She pushed it open with shaking hands. Inside, the room was filled with children's toys, dolls with cracked porcelain faces, wooden trains, stuffed animals with missing eyes. In the middle of the room was a child's bed, and on the bed, something lay under a sheet. Nora's breath caught in her throat. The sheet rose and fell slightly, as if breathing. Something whispered her name. She turned and fled, back up the stairs, tripping over her feet, scraping her hands on the rough stone walls. When she burst through the trapdoor, she slammed it shut and threw the rug back over it. But the room was no longer empty. The rocking chair had stopped. Sitting in it was something that looked like a woman. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp bones, black hair falling in clumps over her shoulders. Her eyes were two black pits, bottomless and cold. She smiled slowly, teeth thin and sharp. "Welcome home," it whispered. Nora backed out of the room, slamming the door shut. She ran down the hall, but the house wasn't the same. The walls bled dark stains. The floors groaned under invisible weight. Every door she opened led back to the same place, the forgotten room, and the door was always open. That night, her husband found her sitting on the floor in front of it, staring at the rocking chair. She didn't respond when he called her name. Her eyes were wide and glassy. He shook her, tried to pull her away, but when he touched her, she was ice cold. He closed the door and carried her downstairs. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep. Days passed. Then he found the door again. It had moved. Now it was in their bedroom. At night, he heard it creak open, heard something breathing just beyond it. He boarded it up, nailed it shut. But in the morning, the boards were gone, and the door stood open. People say the Ashcroft house is empty now, but sometimes, at night, a dim light can be seen in a second-floor window. A woman stands there, staring out, unmoving. If you walk up to the house, you'll hear the faint creak of a rocking chair. And if you're foolish enough to go inside, you'll find the door to the forgotten room. It's always there, always open, and something inside is waiting. 7th story. The mirror never lie. Rachel had always believed mirrors were just glass and silver, reflections of the world, and nothing more. She never thought they could be something else, something watching, something waiting. But that changed the day she moved into the old townhouse on Carter Street. The mirror in the upstairs hallway came with the house. Tall and narrow, its frame was carved with twisting patterns that reminded her of vines or veins. It hung at the end of the hall, opposite her bedroom door, and no matter how she shifted things around, it seemed to pull her gaze at night. At first, it was small things. Her reflection lagged behind just slightly when she moved. She'd wave her hand, and for half a second, it wouldn't move at all. When she smiled, sometimes the smile staring back at her was just a little too wide. It was easy to shrug off in the daytime. blame it on her imagination or tired eyes. But then came the night she woke up and found the bedroom door open. She always closed it before bed. Always. She got up to shut it and glanced down the hall. The mirror was glowing faintly in the dark, like it was catching light from somewhere that didn't exist. She stared for a long time before stepping closer. In the glass, her reflection was there, standing where she stood. But there was something wrong with its eyes. Too dark, too deep, and its smile stretched farther than it should, as if the corners of its mouth could tear. She slammed the door and didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, she covered the mirror with a sheet. She felt foolish, but it gave her some relief. For a while. Then the dream started. She dreamed she was standing in front of the mirror again, peeling away the sheet even though she didn't want to. Her hands weren't her own. She'd see herself on the other side, only it wasn't her. The thing behind the glass was waiting, its skin too pale, its fingers twitching like broken spiders. "You're not real," she whispered in the dream, and the reflection whispered back, "But I am." Each morning, she found the sheet crumpled on the floor, no matter how tightly she pinned it. Her reflection would grin at her as she hurried to cover it again, as if amused by her fear. One evening, she called her friend Mara, begged her to come over and see it for herself. Mara laughed at first, but agreed. She always liked spooky stories. When Mara arrived, she stood in front of the mirror, looking bored. "It's just a mirror, Rach," she said. "You're freaking yourself out." "Watch," Rachel whispered. "Watch it." They stood there for a long time. Nothing happened. Rachel's hands shook. She swore the reflection was breathing heavier than they were, but Mara only sighed. Then Mara frowned. "Wait." Her reflection wasn't moving anymore. She blinked in confusion, but the reflection stared straight ahead, frozen. Then its hand twitched, slow at first, then faster. Its head tilted, sharp and unnatural, until its chin touched its shoulder. Mara stepped back. The reflection stayed where it was, twisted and smiling. "Let's get out of here," Mara whispered. They turned, but Rachel felt something cold grip her wrist. She screamed. Mara pulled at her, but Rachel couldn't move. She looked back. Her reflection's hand was pressed flat against the inside of the glass. The skin was cracking at the edges, thin lines of darkness spreading out like veins. Its eyes were pits, and from them ran something thick and black, like oil. "Come in," it mouthed. Mara yanked Rachel hard, and they both stumbled away. They slammed the bedroom door shut and barricaded it with furniture. But all night, they heard the soft tap, tap, tap on the wood, and beneath it, a faint voice whispering her name. Rachel left the house the next morning. She stayed with Mara, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the mirror. And worse, she saw her reflection, still staring. But she wasn't looking out anymore. She was inside. It happened slowly. Mara stopped calling her by her name, stopped looking at her directly. Rachel noticed it when Mara flinched at her touch, when she avoided mirrors entirely. "What's wrong with me?" Rachel asked one night, desperate. Mara stared at her, pale and trembling. "You're not Rachel," she whispered. Rachel laughed, but it didn't sound right. It was too high, too thin. She ran to the bathroom, to the mirror. The face that looked back wasn't hers. The eyes were too black. The mouth was too wide. She raised her hands to touch her cheeks, but the reflection stayed still. And then it smiled, slowly, awkwardly, like it was still learning. Behind her, Mara screamed. When Rachel turned, there was no one there. only the faintest reflection of herself in the mirror behind her, watching with hollow, empty eyes. The house on Carter Street sits abandoned now. The mirror still hangs at the end of the hall, uncovered. Some nights, people say you can see a woman standing there, staring into it. 8th story, creep at midnight. The town of Millhaven had always been quiet after dark. People shut their doors early, kept their curtains drawn, and avoided looking out their windows, especially after midnight. It wasn't because of superstition, it was because they knew what waited outside. They called it the creep. No one knew where it came from or when it started, only that it moved through the streets when the clock struck 12. Always silent, always watching. If you heard it, you were lucky. If you saw it, you had time to run. But if it knocked, it was already too late. Eli didn't believe in the stories. He was 17, too old for ghost tales whispered by old men in the diner. His friends dared him to stay out after midnight to prove the creep was just some dumb legend. So on a cold Friday night, Eli stood on the corner of Main Street with nothing but his flashlight and his phone. Midnight wasn't far off. The town was dead silent. Not a single light in any window. Even the stray cats were gone. At 11:57, Eli started to feel something shift in the air. The silence wasn't normal. It was heavy, thick like fog, even though the street was clear. The breeze stopped. The streetlights buzzed, flickered once, then went dark. His phone lost signal, and then he heard it. Footsteps, not on the pavement, on something softer, wet. The sound came from behind him, slow at first. Step, drag, step, drag. He swung his flashlight around. Nothing, just empty street and shuttered windows. He laughed nervously. "Nice try," he said to no one. "You guys almost had me." But there was no reply. Then the church bell rang. Midnight. And Eli froze. The footsteps quickened. They circled him. Too fast. Too close. He turned in a slow circle, flashlight beam trembling, and then he saw it. A shape. Thin and tall, but crooked, like its limbs bent the wrong way. Its face was pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over its skull. It had no eyes, just hollow sockets that wept something dark, and its mouth, wide, grinning, with rows of tiny teeth like sewing needles. The creep stopped in front of him, tilted its head, and raised its hand. Eli didn't wait. He ran, heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. He sprinted down Main Street toward his house. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. But the steps were always right behind him. Step, drag, step, drag. He didn't dare look back. He reached his house and slammed the door shut, locked it, bolted it. His parents were gone for the weekend. He was alone. He turned off all the lights and crawled into the space between the couch and the wall, clutching his phone, even though it was dead. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps. Not on the door, on the living room window. Eli squeezed his eyes shut. Another knock. Louder, closer, on the wall behind him. He held his breath. Then the voice came. Software. Wet. Eli. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He couldn't move. Eli, I see you. The space between the couch and the wall grew cold. Colder than ice. He heard something slide against the wood floor. Slow. Scraping. A hand, long and bone-thin, reached into the gap, fingers searching. They were wrong. Too many joints. The nails were sharp and black. He bolted out of his hiding spot and ran upstairs, slammed his bedroom door and locked it. He shoved his dresser in front of it, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The knocking came again, this time on his closet door. He hadn't opened that closet in weeks. Something inside was breathing, slow, ragged, and then the door handle turned. Slowly. Eli grabbed his baseball bat and stood, shaking. When the door creaked open, nothing came out, just darkness. But in the dark, two pale hands reached around the frame, and then the creep's face emerged, its grin even wider now. Eli swung the bat. It passed through empty air. The creep was gone. The closet door swung shut on its own. The room was silent. The next morning, his parents found the house exactly as they left it, except Eli was gone. His phone lay in the middle of the living room. Its screen was cracked, but it was on, recording. The video was short. It showed Eli's terrified face, whispering over and over, "Don't open the door, don't open the door." But someone did, and the last frame was his bedroom window. Open, curtains fluttering. The police searched for weeks. They found no trace. But people in Millhaven say that if you walk Main Street after dark, sometimes you hear footsteps behind you. And if you glance in a window at midnight, you'll see Eli standing there, mouth open, eyes gone. And if you're really unlucky, you'll hear the knock. 3 taps, and the creep will be there, smiling. 9th story. Something was watching me at 3 a.m. It was 3 a.m. when I woke up. Not to a sound or a nightmare, but because I felt something. That cold, crawling sensation you get when someone's staring at you. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The room was silent, still, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I was wide awake, and my heart was already pounding. I rolled over slowly, careful not to move too much. My phone was on the nightstand, face down. I turned it over and tapped the screen. 3:02 a.m. The glow from it lit up the room for just a second, and I saw nothing out of the ordinary. But I couldn't fall back asleep. The air felt wrong, heavy. It was like the darkness itself was thicker than it should be. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I was being stupid, that it was just insomnia, anxiety, whatever. But then I heard it, breathing, soft at first, ragged, not mine. It came from the corner of the room, the darkest part, where the light from the street didn't reach. I froze, holding my breath. It kept going, in and out, slow, wet. I wanted to turn the light on. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. Something inside me said not to. Like if I acknowledged it, if I let it know I knew it was there, it would get worse. But I couldn't just lay there. I reached for my phone again. Maybe if I turned on the flashlight. Maybe. The breathing stopped. I froze again, listening, waiting, and then I heard the floor creak. Just once. A soft groan of wood, right by the foot of my bed, closer than before, closer than it should have been. My skin prickled, my stomach twisted. My hand was shaking so bad I nearly dropped the phone. I turned on the flashlight. There was nothing there. But when I swung the beam toward the corner, I saw it. Eyes, pale, cloudy, reflecting back the light like an animal's in the dark. They blinked once, slow, as if surprised to be seen. I scrambled out of bed and hit the wall switch. The room flooded with light. Empty. My breath was coming fast. Too fast. My chest hurt. But I was alone. I looked. I checked the closet, under the bed, behind the dresser. Nothing. I left the lights on and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm down. At 3:33 a.m., the power went out. The lights blinked off. My phone screen died in my hand. The room plunged into pitch black, so dark I couldn't even see my hand in front of my face. And then the breathing started again, closer this time, right in front of me. I backed up against the wall, My fingers found the edge of the bed. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. It was as if the air was too thick to let it out. Then I felt it. A hand, ice cold, with 2 long fingers, brushed my ankle. Gentle, almost curious. I jerked away, but there was nowhere to go. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, not like you hear with your ears. It was inside my head, a whisper so sharp it made my teeth hurt. "I see you." I slammed my eyes shut. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I couldn't see it, it would go away. But when I opened them again, it was worse. The room was still dark, but something was there, right in front of me. Tall, thin, its head tilted, and I could feel it smiling, even though I couldn't see its face. It reached toward me again, and its fingers pressed against my forehead. Cold sank into my skull, down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. And then, nothing. I woke up in bed, the lights back on. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. 7 a.m. Sunlight streamed through the window like nothing had happened. For a second, I convinced myself it was a nightmare. A really, really vivid one, until I saw the handprint. A perfect print. 5 long fingers, too long, pressed into the skin of my ankle like a bruise. It stayed there for days. No matter what I did, it wouldn't fade. And ever since that night, I wake up at 3 a.m. every night, and I know it's watching me, still, waiting for something. Some nights I can hear it whispering from the dark corner of my room. It says the same thing every time. "I see you." And I know, one night soon, it's going to do more than watch. 10th story. The scariest night of my life. It was supposed to be a normal night, just another evening alone at home while my parents were away for the weekend. I had done this before. No big deal. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and settled on the couch with my laptop. The house was quiet, too quiet, but I didn't mind. At around 11 p.m., I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a creeping sense that something wasn't right. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to being alone in a big, empty house. But then the power flickered, just for a second. The Wi-Fi went out. My laptop screen showed the buffering symbol, and my phone lost its signal. Annoying, but not terrifying. Not yet. I got up to check the router in the hallway. The house felt colder than before, like a window had been left open, but I knew everything was locked. That's when I heard the first sound, a faint tapping on the front window. I froze. It was light, almost delicate, like fingertips brushing against the glass. My heart started pounding. I lived in a quiet neighborhood, no traffic, no late-night visitors. Who would be out there at this hour? I took slow steps toward the window, but kept my distance. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued, more insistent, more urgent. Then it stopped. For a long moment, I stood there, listening. Nothing, just silence. But as soon as I let out a breath, there was a new sound. The back door handle jiggled. I spun around, my stomach dropping. Someone was trying to get in. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. My hands were shaking. I stood there, heart hammering, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, dragging, moving around the outside of the house. I inched toward the back door, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. I reached for my phone to call the police, but there was no signal, just static. Then my phone screen went black. A sharp knock came from the hallway. Inside the house. I turned so fast I nearly fell. I had locked everything. I knew I had. But something, was inside. My breath hitched. The air felt thick, heavy. I gripped the knife tighter. The hallway was dark, too dark, and at the far end, near my bedroom door, I saw it. A figure, tall, thin, its body slightly hunched, like its bones weren't meant to fit inside its skin. Its arms were too long, fingers dragging against the floor. Its head twitched, and I realized it had no face, just smooth, pale skin where its features should have been. I backed away, my entire body shaking. It took a step forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It made no sound, but I could feel it staring. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, more like a whisper inside my skull, it said, "You shouldn't be here alone." I ran. I bolted for the front door, fumbled with the lock, yanked it open, and stumbled onto the porch. The night air was freezing, but I didn't care. I sprinted down the driveway, not daring to look back. I ran to my neighbor's house, pounded on the door, screaming for help. When they finally answered, the lights from inside flooded the porch. I turned to look at my house. Nothing. No figure in the hallway. No movement. The windows were dark. The door still open behind me. The police came, checked the house, found nothing. Every door was locked. Every window secured. No signs of a break-in. But I know what I saw. That was the scariest night of my life. And every night since, I feel it watching, waiting, because now it knows me.